Cultural relativism. I think for many people, cultural relativism is a response to the complexity of moral issues and the number of different responses various groups or cultures have given to moral issues. So for many, when we look at just how different cultures have responded to different issues, the way different cultures, for example, treat women or minorities, or the way different cultures approach things like sexual morality, that when we see all this diversity, that there seems to be a response where we want to say, well, maybe there isn't some sort of absolute right or wrong. Maybe morality really is just relative to a different group, that different people believe different things. And this in some ways is the basis of cultural relativism. Now, there are a number of general features to cultural relativism. So cultural relativists generally hold most, if not all, of the following points. First, cultural relativists recognize that different societies have different moral codes. So while our moral codes, say in North America, the United States, Canada, and other Western countries may be very similar, we also see a real divergence in moral views when we get into radically different cultures. So if we go to the East or the Middle East, even sometimes in the South, we'll see that different societies and different, especially when we get into small tribal societies or smaller groups, that they have radically different views on what's moral and what's not moral. Another feature of cultural relativism is the idea that there's no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code better than another. So for the cultural relativist, most cultural relativists will say that if there's no objective standard in morality, or if there are all these radically different moral viewpoints, then there's no one standard. There's no one principle or one idea that can judge between all these different moral codes. A third feature of cultural relativism is the idea that the moral code of our own society has no special status, that is merely one among many. So one of the interesting elements of cultural relativism is it's very egalitarian. That is to say, it views all moral codes as equally good. Right? So to say that we have some sort of special morality, that our view is better in some way than some other culture, would be a mistake. That's what the cultural relativists would refer to as ethnocentrism, the view that our moral code is better than another's. For the relativists, if there's no objective moral standard, if there's no absolute moral truth, then, well, our code can't be better than someone else's because there is no objective standard to compare it to. And this, of course, then follows there is no universal truth in ethics. There's no one right or wrong answer to any sort of moral problem. So one culture may choose to solve their problem or their issue one way. Another culture chooses to solve that same problem in a completely different way. And both would be essentially right because there is no truth in ethics. The moral code of a society determines what is right within that society. And this, of course, would be sort of the basis for all social moral codes for the cultural relativists. Whatever my society happens to say at any given time is what's going to be right, whatever we mean by right. It's right for that group. It's right for that society. But that doesn't imply that there's anything absolutely right or universally right about that position. So the moral code of one society determines what's right or wrong, but it doesn't have any special status. And finally, what the relativists will say is that it's mere arrogance for us to try to judge the conduct of other peoples. So when we look at a different culture and say, I can't believe that they're doing that, or look how barbaric that sort of practice is, cultural relativist is going to say, well, on what basis are you making that judgment, right? There is no absolute truth. And if there's no absolute truth in ethics, then you can't say that that culture is doing something bad. You can't judge that culture or that cultural practice as being inferior. Now, there's a number of implications of this, and we're going to get to sort of the implications and why the relativist holds these things. In part, I've already sort of alluded to why they hold this, part just because the fact of different moral codes. But I want to go and give an example first and just show how easy it is to fall into relativism. I think it's an interesting phenomenon that many people, many individuals, will often think they know the morally right thing, but when pressed to give reasons, can't find the reasons or can't articulate their reasons for a particular moral view. And I think at times when this happens, they end up resulting to a sort of relativist approach. So they might say something, well, I can't give you reason, but that's just what we do here. or we don't believe in that. And when that happens, when someone's reasons give way, or they aren't able to articulate their reasons, even if they really are moral people, even if they really do think there's a moral right or wrong, sometimes when pushed, they fall into relativism. So let me give you an example of how this works, and an example I often use in my classes. I put forth the following proposition, what I think everyone should be able to give a response to. So let's say I hold the following position. So here's my crazy example for you. My moral position is this: eating babies for breakfast is a good thing. There is nothing morally wrong with doing so. So let's imagine for a minute that I put this up on the board for you and I say, give me reasons why this moral position is wrong. Now, immediately, there are a number of things that will probably come to mind. First, you might say, well, that's against the law, right? So killing or murder is against the law. And so I say, well, that's a good point. Murder is against the law, but what if I were to go and get the law changed? So let's say I go down to Columbus or grease a few palms, get some legislators to change the law, and they now say in Ohio it's morally okay to eat babies for breakfast. And now I say to you, is that okay now? Is this moral position now true? And you're probably going to say, well, no, it doesn't matter whether they change the law. It's still wrong. So your response to me when I say, well, what makes this wrong? Or how would you respond? Saying that the law says it's not a good thing doesn't really matter. The law may be moral, the law may be immoral. There are crazy laws on the books and there are very good laws on the books. And then you say, well, it has nothing to do with the law. It doesn't matter what the law says. What really matters is that murder is wrong. And so then I might push you. I say, well, why is murder wrong? You say, well, murder is wrong because it's murder. And I say, well, you're going to need a better reason than that. Why is murder wrong? And so now we get into sort of possibly a meta-ethical position or some other where you have to give me, well, why is murder wrong? And sometimes what I'll find is students will sort of flail around. Well, it's wrong because it hurts people. I say, well, yeah, I know it hurts, but why is hurting people wrong? And again, this becomes problematic. And you say, well, because you shouldn't do that. Well, why shouldn't you do that? And so it seems that when I push this, I say, well, we all know that hurting people is a bad thing. And I said, well, we don't all know because obviously I don't hold that position. So it's not we all know. And so this is where you can see easily it falls into relative. Well, I know this is wrong, but we don't do that around here. And thus you see a sort of relativist position. You say, well, somebody else might do that. And I might point out, well, isn't it true that other cultures practice cannibalism? You say, well, yeah. Well, then it must be okay for us. Well, no, that's what they do. We don't do that. Notice when I make that sort of distinction, when I say, well, it's okay what they do. That's their thing, and I'm not going to judge them. But for us, that would be wrong. Well, that's a relativist position. And we can go right down the line with this. So when we lack reasons for our moral convictions, oftentimes relativism becomes the result, even when we do think that sort of intuitively we know what the right or wrong thing is. So many times, relativism is a response to this. We look and you can give a counterexample. So even a crazy example like this, eating another human being, it's possible to find examples of other groups that have actually done this. And so you say, well, why is that wrong? So what we're looking for is something absolute, I think. We're looking for something to appeal to say, well, that's just wrong. And of course, there's other there's other responses one could give this. We'll talk about some of these later. Some often I'll get the response, well, God says so, or the Bible tells me that's wrong. And of course, the response would be, well, and here's where the moral motivation part comes in. What if I were to say I'm agnostic or I'm atheist? And in such a case, that reason might not hold. You say, well, is it unreasonable for someone to not believe in a divine being? I don't think so. I don't think we want to say they're irrational or that it's unreasonable for them to question the existence of a divine being. So I could respond in that saying, well, you still haven't told me why eating babies for breakfast is a good thing. I don't share your belief system. So give me some other reason, something that doesn't rely on belief. Give me a reason. And again, you might go back and say, well, again, we don't do that in our society. So relativism, I think, is this sort of response at times to this, even when we have good reason, which is why it's very important to understand how to make a good moral argument, why it's good to understand why there are, or what other sort of moral principles one could appeal to when trying to refute such a moral position, even one as crazy as this one. So let's talk a little bit more about the relativist position. Why does the cultural relativist hold that there's no moral objective truth in ethics? Well, they appeal in mainly, and this is again is from your textbook, they appeal to a cultural difference argument. It says premise one is that different cultures have different moral codes. So culture one has code X, culture two, whatever that culture may be, has code Y, and therefore there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion. So for the relativist, it's simply an empirical matter. If in fact there was an absolute sort of moral code or an absolute right and wrong, surely we'd be able to find it. We'd look at all these different moral codes in different societies and we'd find that they all have some sort of common precept. So there might be differences between various cultures, but we'd still find a lot of overlap. And that might, for the relativist, indicate that there's something like objective truth. But the thing is that many societies have radically different moral codes that we can't reconcile. At least that's the argument the cultural relativists will give. And because of that, it indicates that there is no objective truth in ethics. Now, what's the problem with the cultural difference arguments? Well, in part, one of the problems is that it doesn't follow from the fact that individuals believe X, that X is in fact the case. So let's think about what it means to say that a culture has a particular moral code. What we're saying is something like this. We're saying, well, this culture, this group of individuals believes that this action or these actions are right and that these other actions are wrong. But the fact that I believe something doesn't make it so. It's possible, and in fact there are people today who believe the earth is flat. Now even if a large number of people believed that the earth was flat, and there is actually, if you look, you can find the Flat Earth Society, it still exists. It used to be based out of Case Western Reserve University, sort of strange as that sounds. But there were individuals who said, no, the earth, even to this day, is flat. Now, they can believe that all they want. It doesn't make it the case. And that seems to be one of the responses we can give to the relativists. Is, look, the fact that people believe that action's right or wrong doesn't settle the issue. They could still all be wrong. One society could be completely wrong on a particular moral position. So there may be, then, an objective truth in morality or an objective truth in ethics, even if individuals aren't aware of what that truth is. So that's one sort of problem with the relativist argument, that we make mistakes. We're fallible individuals, and we're fallible as groups as well. So this argument will work equally well when we talk a little bit about subjectivism. But that's one of the problems with this cultural difference argument. Now, as I've already mentioned, cultural relativism for some is a response to an inability to give really good reasons or sort of knockdown reasons for a particular moral viewpoint. So people will sort of hide away with the, well, this is just what we do. But there are others that actually take cultural relativism very seriously. They say, no, I don't believe that there is enough evidence to support the idea that there is, in fact, an objective morality, that I don't see any objective right or wrong, some absolute notion of right or wrong. Now, if you want to be a relativist, and you want to embrace the relativist viewpoint, then you're also going to have to embrace the consequences of relativism. So one of the consequences is that if you accept the truth of cultural relativism, then we can no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. Now, that may not seem particularly problematic, but I think there are times when we do want to say that certain practices are in fact wrong. It's not just different. These aren't just practices that are different, but they are actually wrong. So, for instance, we may want to say things like female circumcision is wrong, or genocide is wrong. It doesn't matter whether that culture thinks genocide is a good way of dealing with disputes between groups. If a particular culture decides that it's okay to completely remove a tribal group or a race from the earth, that society is wrong. But if you're a relativist, you would have to say, well, no, that's just one way of dealing with conflict. There are many ways we could deal with conflict. We could try negotiation. We could try some sort of payment for land or territory. But in many cases, the response would be, no, genocide. And the cultural relativists would have to say, that's perfectly acceptable. Now, another problem with relativism is the problem of current social practices. If we accept the truth of cultural relativism, then it would follow that we could decide all questions of right and wrong by appealing to current societal practices. So what this is saying is that if the cultural relativist is correct, then we shouldn't have any real moral disagreement. That our current moral code, our current social code, would be able to settle all sort of moral disputes. So when we think about this, we say something like, well, what's right or wrong is determined by a particular society. And if we come across a new moral issue, then that society will sort of sit down and sort of vote on what's right or wrong, or somehow come to a conclusion. But it seems that there are times when our current moral codes, our current moral system can't handle new moral issues. That society can't actually figure out what's right or wrong just by appealing to our current practices. For instance, new technology often challenges our moral code, where we need to start to look and say, our code doesn't have an answer to this. We can't just appeal to what we have here. We need to think about this in a new way. Now, for the relativists, all moral issues should be able to be dealt with by appealing to our current societal practices. But things like, for instance, stem cell research might pose new challenges to a societal practice or to our societal code. And it's the case that we often find that our current practices, our current views, are unable to solve these problems. And so that we might be looking for some sort of new moral solution, something that might come from outside our code, or a new way of thinking about things. So if you're a cultural relativist, you almost have to say, well, all issues can be decided just by appealing to our social code, but as it turns out, that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, probably one of the most troubling aspects of cultural relativism, aside from our inability to judge other cultures, is the problem of moral progress. And the problem of moral progress goes something like this. According to the relativists, whatever a society agrees is moral or immoral is moral or immoral for that society at any given time. So what do we want to say about the state of the United States, say, in 2012? Is it better or worse than the United States in 1912? How about 1812, 1712? If you accept a relativist position, then you can't actually say that 2012, or our society in 2012, is better than our society in 1912 or 1812. Now that seems like a pretty silly thing to say. It seems like we can say we have made moral progress. We can appeal to things like race relations or to women getting the right to vote. Now, if you're a relativist, you would have to say that there was nothing wrong with women not having the right to vote. So prior to the 1920s, women didn't have the right to vote. What would the relativists say? Well, the relativists say, well, there's nothing morally wrong with denying women the right to vote. Or there'd be nothing wrong with slavery. If you're a relativist, you say, well, in 1860, slavery was okay. And in fact, there's nothing morally wrong with slavery. And then if I say, but haven't we gotten better? Haven't we, as a society, made moral progress by getting rid of slavery through civil rights, through women's rights, and so forth? Isn't that a better society? And the relativists would have to say that no, in fact, there is no better or worse. It's just what is at any given time. And this clearly seems wrong. Maybe right now it's only an intuition. It's intuitively wrong. We don't have a reason, but it seems that we've made moral progress. We want to be able to say that one moral state of affairs, even within a particular society, is better or worse than it was at some other given time. That we can sort of appeal to some standards and say, no, we have made moral progress. We're a morally better people. That's not something open to the cultural relativist. The relativist will simply have to acknowledge that, well, it was right at that time, it's wrong now. But one's not any better or worse than the other. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the sort of empirical claims that the relativist is making is that cultures are radically different. And so we might ask, well, are cultures really that different? So we know that there are different social moral codes. We know that there are different rules of how to behave. But are those rules actually that different? So underlying those rules, the ideas or the concepts, are those really that different? Well, when we look at various cultures, what we notice is that, in fact, that they aren't all that different. So for instance, all cultures, at least all successful cultures, have some way of preserving the young. Right? So there are rules about taking care of the most vulnerable. Cultures that don't take care of their young tend not to be around much because there are no more people to populate their group. So it seems that while these rules seem radically different, what we allow or don't allow or have say, children do. So in certain tribal groups, you might have very young children going out on hunting and engaging in dangerous activity. It seems that, in part, those dangerous activities are to prepare them for life in the community, to help them survive a harsh environment. And so even though it may seem harsh to us, or may seem that's what kids shouldn't be doing, those sorts of things, underlying that idea is that, no, this is necessary for preserving that young person. So all cultures seem to have this sort of underlying idea that they preserve their young. All cultures have some rules prohibiting the arbitrary taking of a life. There's no successful culture that simply says it's okay whenever you feel like it to take someone else's life. If that were the case, there would be anarchy. It would be a war of all against all. And the odds of a group, in particular, a societal group or tribal group succeeding, would be really, the probability would be extremely low if we just let people take life. So all cultures seem to have rules about the arbitrary taking of others' lives. And finally, there are rules of discourse. It seems that all cultures have ways of handling disputes, have ways of communicating. There's a sort of set of common conventions for discourse and debate. And that cultures that don't have this tend not to stay together. That underlying it, there are rules, even if those rules might be based on seniority. So, for instance, a king or an elder, who can talk, when they can talk, who has standing, all of those things contribute to rules of discourse. And it seems that oftentimes these rules or this order for society is there to help perpetuate the society. And so we need rules of discourse. So while they may be radically different, and there's still plenty of room for criticism in these things, it seems that there are a lot of commonalities between cultures. Now, can we, even if we are relativists, let's assume for a minute we've accepted the relativist position. Are there ways of judging other cultures? Well, morally speaking, it's problematic. If you're a relativist and you look at another culture and want to make an objection to that culture, you're going to find it's difficult to actually make any sort of moral distinction. In fact, you can judge other cultures if you're a relativist, but you can only do so on objective standards. So one way a relativist might be able to, or we might be able to judge another culture, is on objective standards. So how well do the current practices of that society meet their needs and or values? So for instance, I might say, if there's a practice in that culture which is intended to increase the population, I might say to that group, even if I find that practice sort of barbaric, is this practice actually doing what you want it to do? Can I look at a culture nearby or another group nearby and say, look, they don't practice this, and yet they have a higher population or larger population than you? And if that's the case, I could point out that, look, your societal practice is not actually meeting the needs or values of your group. And so we can sort of make objective standards. If the group population is going down, then it might show that objectively their practice is not working. Now, that's not to say that we've made any moral evaluation. So it may still be the case that we think that the practice they're doing is morally wrong, but we're not making a moral evaluation. We're simply saying, as a practical matter, this isn't doing what you want it to do. Is the welfare of individuals in a society better served by a different moral code? So another way of looking at it, instead of the values of the group, we might say, is there a better way of doing a certain thing, having a certain practice, that would benefit the individual? So individuals in this other society are better off. They tend to be more successful. They tend to have more food. They tend to be happier with a different set of practices. Now, again, these are not making objective standards. I'm not making an objective claim about morality. What I'm saying is the practices that a particular culture may follow may not be serving the individuals as well as some other practice they could follow. So we can sort of point to objective standards in cultures, but what relativism does is it turns off from us any sort of claim of a moral superiority, right? We can't make a moral claim. We can't say, look, individuals are suffering, and they're suffering in a way that's morally objectionable. All we can say is, no, your practices aren't making people happy, but we can't say that, and you have an obligation to make people happy, or people have a right to be better off in your society. We can't use those terms like right or obligation. We would have to simply point to some sort of objective criteria. So there is sort of a way we can judge other cultures objectively, but it doesn't seem to have the same punch that a moral objection does. That when people are bad off in a society, or they're practicing something that we consider morally wrong, those sort of reasons or that those sort of things can't be leveled against the culture. Now, what can we take of value from relativism? There are a couple of things. The first thing we want to point out is that different practices are not equivalent to different moral principles between cultures. As your book notes about the difference between Greek burial rites and the group in India, that the fact that two groups do something radically different in practice doesn't mean that the underlying moral principles aren't the same thing. So we want to be careful when we judge other cultures and say, just because this practice looks different to us, it may in fact have underlying it the same moral principle. They may be endorsing the same sort of set of moral values. Another valuable insight of relativism is to be careful with mixing moral criticisms with aesthetic criticisms. So an aesthetic criticism is a criticism of taste. So imagine, for example, that you and I go to Baskin-Robbins, where they have 35 flavors of ice cream. And I walk into Baskin-Robbins and I say, I'll have the double chocolate chip whatever. And I say to you, what are you going to have? And you say, I'll have vanilla. And I look at you and say, what's wrong with you? You can't have vanilla. That's wrong to eat vanilla. All these 35 flavors. And what are you getting? Vanilla. Now, you'd probably step away from me and give me a look saying, well, I like vanilla. And I say, there's nothing wrong with me going into a place that serves 35 different types of ice cream and me just getting vanilla. If that's what I like, that's what I like. There's no moral component to that at all. And sometimes I think that's what we do with morality. We look at a particular way of doing things, and we don't have any good moral reason for condemning it, but it's just distasteful to us in some way. And so when we're looking at different practices, we want to be careful that we're actually making a moral distinction. When we judge another culture, when we judge an action, we want to make sure it's a moral judgment we're making and not just something that isn't appealing to us. Just like ice cream. I may like double chocolate chip chunk Rocky Road combination ice cream, and whatever it is I happen to like, that's me, and there's nothing right or wrong about that. It's just what I happen to like, my taste. And you may have a completely different taste, but that doesn't mean that that one or both of us is morally right or wrong. That's an aesthetic distinction. It's a distinction of taste. So relativists remind us, even if we don't buy into cultural relativism as a whole, that oftentimes we can make a mistake between a moral judgment and an aesthetic judgment.